Mad, 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 Mad World in 1963 captures the character's descent into treasure fever and insanity. That movie is worth your time to watch. It's family friendly. It includes an all-star cast of that era, and it certainly beats one more iteration of the Christmas prince who wore a sweater on the holiday when it snowed back home in the country with a city girl who learns to love and make a mean potluck for the church casserole, and he finds Jesus in Santa's sleigh under the light of Rudolph's nose. Or whatever it is they show on Hallmark Channel. It's a mad, 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 mad world. Has a delightfully silly script. Each of the characters thinks all the other treasure hunters have gone crazy, never realizing how close they themselves are to breaking their own sanity. Maybe you like the 1976 movie Network. Captures the moment, perhaps even predicted our contemporary infotainment news with that great catchphrase, "I'm as mad as heck, and I'm not gonna take this anymore," shouted out of windows across the movie set and across the nation. Look around us. It seems that 2020 has just shoved our culture to the breaking point. County dictators decreed Thanksgiving canceled last week, and they are threatening Christmas already in your own home. But maybe we just don't have anything to be thankful for anymore. Seeing as how YouTube, it's got its finger on the pulse, celebrated instead un-Thanksgiving Day this year about American Indian grievances. Of course, we seem to worship that weirdo, Dr. Fauci, and his sacraments of social distance, business lockdowns, and flimsy masks. Oh, great Savior Fauci and your almighty host of bureaucrats, please make me into an essential human being. Life, once again, has been revealed to be all too fragile and finite. As we careen toward our breaking point like Bambi on ice, we look back over our shoulders to the good old days when God really mattered and we were really devoted to him. Like ancient Judah, we look back wistfully at what God used to do around here. Why won't he make it like it was back then? For them, it was the Exodus, kicking Pharaoh's tail, giving them the 10 Commandments at Mount Sinai, sending the manna and the quail and the water from the rock out in the wilderness. For us, we look back to 1963, when 2/3 or more of all middle-class white teenagers and children were in church 2 to 3 times a week, singing in the choir, going on trips, and so forth. Judah forgets that the golden calf incident happened at the same trip to Mount Sinai. We forget about slavery and reservations and civil rights that excluded blacks, Hispanics, Asians, and American Indians. Ancient Judah also overlooks their current to the time of the Isaiah reading, their abdication of rebuilding the temple and worshiping in favor of taking care of their own homes and businesses first. We overlook our ugly morals of personal fulfillment through consumer choices such as lust, gluttony, and coveting. Just like ancient Judah, the mess we're in, the breaking point we're headed toward is our own fault. The good old days is just an evil idol, a false G-O-D, good old days. The prophets cry that, "Oh, you, God, would rend the heavens and come down," is as timely today as it was some 2,500 or more years ago. How we long for that infinite power to break into our finite world as if we could bear it should it happen. Think about that. Could our frail and finite existence actually bear the full presence of God's infinite, all-encompassing existence? To say it crudely, He's bigger and more powerful than everything that exists. Nothing exists without Him to hold it together. And besides, we exist in a world of space and time and free choices or actions. So all we have is our experience of these things to try and wrap our heads around God, who is beyond the limitations of time and space and physics, Newtonian or quantum. So for the season of Advent, we'll consider just how the finite around us signifies what's infinite. Several examples come to mind. The first two are some traditional Christian artwork. First being a traditional depiction, speaking of the Exodus story, of the burning bush, shown as a prototype of the Virgin Mary. Think about that. The burning bush held the very presence of God Himself, and it was not consumed, not burned up by it. The second is also a depiction of the Virgin Mary, with her hands up in the prayer position like so, with a sort of halo around her womb, depicting within it the fully formed Christ child. In Greek, this picture is called the Platytera, or interpreted, she who is wider than the heavens, because she contains within her womb the very one without whom nothing came into existence, as St. John writes in his gospel. Third, let me point you to Holy Communion, in which the finite bread and wine bring us the very infinite presence of God the Son in His own body and blood. Or fourth, consider the two natures of Jesus, that He's fully God and fully human, neither blending nor mixing the two natures together, yet constituting a single person, so that His infiniteness and His finiteness exist together mutually. And while philosophers have spilled much ink discussing this idea in finer and finer detail, we can wrap our minds around the main ideas. Our finite God makes use, our infinite God, makes use of our finite world, His finite creation, for His own purposes. And He comes to us, finite, sinful, dying, subjected to evil human beings, to reconcile us to His infinite grace, mercy, and love, forgiveness, life, and salvation, truth, beauty, and goodness. The limited and corrupted things of everyday life around us are exactly what He uses to reveal His unlimited, perfect self to us. And not the idea or the meaning or the representation or the memory of Himself and His purposes, but His actual, literal, graceful, real self. So perhaps our recollection of the good old days isn't all it's cracked up to be. And perhaps we're not as close to cracking up as we fear either. The 12 disciples in the gospel reading can feel the charged air and pregnant circumstances around them in Holy Week as they ask Jesus about the circumstances that we sort of impishly refer to these days as signs of the apocalypse. You know, false messiahs and saviors, wars, rumors of wars, kingdoms rising against kingdoms, earthquakes, famines, persecutions, betrayals, and the like. But even more as the sun goes dark and the heavens shake. And so as usual, Jesus takes what circumstances we give Him and He raises the stakes. Such things are just the birth pangs, the beginning. It'll get worse, much worse than it has ever been, He warns. In fact, He gives these finite things an infinite purpose, rather than distracting us either with themselves and their immediate consequences and uncertainties, or with attempting to read the unknown and hidden mind of God. These things focus us, lead us, serve us with Jesus and his words, his promises, especially his certain and sure return to judge the living and the dead. We may think that God has turned away from us in the global mayhem and local uproar, and sin, death, and the devil's evil indisputably do reveal God's wrath and condemnation to us in our circumstances. However, Martin Luther points out that to have God's face turned toward us, shining upon us, is to see his calm and his peacefulness, his grace and his goodwill toward us. His face shines on us several different ways, Luther notes. Of course, we have those Old Testament theophanies like the pillar of cloud and fire. We also have his word and his sacraments, the means of grace. Also, when God's thoughts are set before our consciences, something to go home and think about. And then when God acts to limit and to remove evil, pestilence, injustice, and so forth. It's that last one that connects back to our Isaiah reading. This so-called temporary and limited signs of the times have been marshaled by our limitless, eternal God, revealing his infiniteness and their finitude. Jesus knows how easy it is for us to miss the point, to not see the forest for the trees, to look down into the abyss of our own navels and the appetites of our bellies. And so he gives these otherwise temporary occurrences an everlasting function, to turn our attention and trust to him, to his return to judge the living and the dead, bringing those whose name is written in heaven into his kingdom, and sending those who aren't into perdition, the outer darkness, filled with weeping and gnashing of teeth. The point of this commotion and turmoil in the world is to prepare the way for Jesus' return into the world, much like labor pains prepare a mother for delivery of a baby into the world. Furthermore, this realization that Jesus teaches to us shows us to be now and already within that same great story that begins with Adam and Eve, continues on with Noah and Abraham and Moses, then on to David and the prophets, the exile and return as Isaiah tells us about today. That great story of God working to accomplish his purposes in his creation, shining his face of goodwill upon it, to redeem it, and especially us, his beloved human creatures, to deliver us whose name is written in the book of heaven. I admit, however, there are still days when facing this mad world that they want to make me stick my head out of the window and yell, "I'm as mad as heck, and I'm not going to take this anymore." Still seems that all across our culture, we anxiously await and anticipate our breaking point, while missing the point to expect and examine and perceive God already at work, to ameliorate, to abate, to alleviate the evil and the pestilence and the injustice that torments us. These events of everyday life that disturb us have a point, to point us to Jesus and his infinite grace and mercy and love. His everlasting promise to come and bring his kingdom to us and us into his kingdom, to drive us to trust in his forgiveness, life, and salvation alone, without our merit or worthiness or good behavior. Rather than hurling invective out of a window, showering our wrath upon an unsuspecting world, we see God's face shining on us when his gifts are used for his purposes in our everyday lives. Providence is another word for this. Well, certainly we might think of the outpouring of materials and work following a natural disaster, like Lake Charles faced twice this year. Or perhaps we think of the restoration to health or the alleviation of symptoms of illness, because God is the author and source of all healing. Or maybe we remember something like the PPP program back in the spring, that although it wasn't pure according to our own political platforms, it gave financial relief when it was needed. 3 brief examples to point us to God's grace and mercy breaking into, shining into our world and its darkness that seems so impenetrable. Jesus brings us comfort with his interpretation of these signs of the times as signifiers of his reign as King of Kings and his kingdom come. Rather than seeing one massive transcendent rip in the heavens, an interdimensional cross rip rending them like the temple curtain, we see countless smaller, immediate rips as God's compassion breaks into the world, as his face shines on us and our neighbors with each suffering that ends. Not only do we look to God in these moments, but we find him at work to bring what only he can, strengthening us for the days ahead, as St. Paul writes. Amen.